Well, first of all, let me congratulate you to this very, very important initiative of yours. I think that Dāphā Calling is a remarkable initiative, and I'm very honored to have been invited to contribute to it. To bring together a forum or a forum like this for the sharing of knowledge about sustainable future for heritage and for this kind of intangible heritage is absolutely crucial. I really also enjoyed the first initiative of yours, or the first round of engaging with Dāphā through rituals and through pedagogy. It is such a central step actually to explore these challenges. And I guess in that context, the phalca as a site where the Dāphā colors are performing is a very, very important part of Newar everyday life, but also, of course, ritual life. Now, how did I get interested in the phalca? And I must say that I'm passionate about it since more than a decade now. It's one of my main fields of research as an urban and visual and media anthropologist. For me, it becomes really an entry gate into studying how urban transformation and social change take place in Kathmandu Valley over the past few years. And I hope that I will continue to be able to come back to Nepal and study this. Now, what I have been doing is that I have been walking the streets of Patan endlessly for years and months and days, from mornings till evenings, even in the middle of the night, to see how the patis shape the city and pattern it actually. And once you have discovered where they are and how crucial they are, you cannot but look for them. And you will find them almost in every corner of a courtyard, of a bahi or baha, or along a street, even though it might be a busy road. And of course, I mean, these patis or phalcas, these arcaded rest houses, as we could call them, they cover the historic cities of Kirtipur, of Bhaktapur, of Shanku, of Patan, and of Kathmandu. And in fact, what is interesting is that despite the argument that very often this kind of heritage is dying out, they are, I would argue, even on the rise. And there's no extinction in sight. And I think this is something important to share with you. Now, what I think is that the phalca is a very unique architectural, but also ritual and social form of urban culture in South Asia. And it's really the fascinating aspect that it is a living part of heritage in South Asia. And that is what fascinated me. I think it is architecturally very interesting to study how they are built, how they are included in various urban codes, but more than that, also how they are socially used. They are used as a living room, they are used as a place to rest, to sleep, to talk, to watch, to gossip, to play music and games, and of course to perform and to exhibit. Very often the phalcas are used to exhibit some of the Bhairav masks, for instance. And of course, in that context, the Dāphā Bhajan plays an absolutely elementary role to uphold the importance of the phalcas. You find them, as I said, as a less spectacular architectural form. And this is why they have not really gained so much attention, and why hardly anybody, except for people like the architecture historian Niels Gutschow, has attended to them. They are not spectacular and worth mentioning, usually in the unique heritage codes where you would classify and attribute value to, such as temples and monasteries. So they are actually, they are maybe rather vernacular and everyday. but they become absolutely important in contexts such as processions, in some of the festivals, the annual festivals, but also in individual neighborhood commemorations. They are still important also when it comes to certain rituals connected to sacrifices. You find long phalcas, sometimes with more than 10 bays, and usually, though, the classical kind of model is the 3 or 5 bayed at the front phalca. Yeah, you find some that are only 1 story high. You find others that are 2 stories high, where the music group, for instance, stores their musical instruments or their mats to perform, pots to also then eat from, or the deities, of course. These are then called sattas. So they are not, there are various subforms then of the phalca. Usually you would find the phalca as part of a larger family of important sites, the shrine or the temple or the well or the jaruhiti. Yeah, hitis are actually very important for phalcas, for ritual purposes. You would find phalcas that are rented out. They have been encroached by shopkeepers who have rented the place and who now maybe also refuse to leave. There are restaurants, small dabbas in there, or maybe tailors. But more often they are the sites where people would come to play cards or marbles, the children usually. Yeah, and so I think this is my entry point to come back to the question that I have been really obsessed, and I think it's an ideal site to study not only Newar heritage, but also how the city changes and how modern new parts come in, especially, and this is something that I have been putting a lot of attention on, especially after the earthquake in 2015. The phalca, so to say, was also rediscovered as a social place, as a place for socializing, as a public and open space that was so rare. Of course, not a safe space necessarily, but something that had regained value, actually. And so for me, and this brings us back to the Dāphā practice, which is, as many say, on the decline because the young people are not ready to invest time and patience in the hard ways of learning Dāphā. The fact that the phalca has actually managed to stay on board of Nepal's modernization and development, I think could also point towards the fact that the Dāphā music is not on the way out, but it could be revived, as you show so amazingly. So I think that's maybe the answer I would, for the time being, give. I would be very happy to come and speak a little bit more in detail about some of the projects that I looked at through phalcas after the earthquake and in the context of art initiatives that I think are a very important way of taking the phalca and probably then also Dāphā music into a very dynamic future. Yeah, the historical significance and actually past of the phalca is very heterogeneous and unfortunately not very well researched. We have our project, the Nepal Heritage Documentation Project, which is trying to map the various moments at which Bahas and Bahis, phalcas, temples, hittis have been donated and created, by whom, and for what reason. Of course, for this we rely on inscriptions, usually attached to the respective sites. In some cases, we also have other documents, manuscripts, letters, and records of personal, for instance, collections. But the phalca is such a type of building that has, besides inscriptions, not really been well recorded. And even today, you don't find inscriptions with every phalca, and sometimes they have also been removed. They might have been dislocated. But what we can say in general is highly interesting, because the phalca as a kind of independent type emerges around the middle of the 17th century, around 1660. And since then, there has been a steady construction activity across the old cities of the royal, usually of the royal territories. This is very interesting because it might be, but there is yet not any kind of connection that has been made. It might be related to an increase or the coming into being of Dāphā during the city Narasimha Mala period. But this is basically yet speculation. But it would be interesting actually to trace that a little bit more. The inscriptions are interesting because they show that there has been a very intense activity of individual families, sometimes also individuals, sometimes couples, married couples, sometimes members of a particular caste, to facilitate the construction of a phalca, usually in their vicinity. A phalca could have been donated for the reason of commemorating the death of a family member, but also other occasions. It can be in the honor of certain events, and for that reason, then usually a phalca would also come along with the formation or inauguration of a kuti that is meant to look after the phalca. Either the keeping of the upkeeping, well-keeping of the site itself, and also the rituals that are connected to it. For instance, the feeding of people on an annual basis in a commemoration ritual, or when a procession is taking place. So then ritual again, site, and and a particular activity are very closely connected. There are certain phalcas also connected to so-called semi-mythological or historical events, such as the arrival of Matsyendranath in Nepal. Yeah, and what is very important in terms of the topography of the phalcas, be they independent or be they incorporated in sattas or in chappas, is that they are sometimes located along trade routes through the Kathmandu Valley, but very often trade routes that allowed for people who were carrying goods from India, let's say, to Tibet, or from Tibet to India, to rest in those places, which is why they are also often called rest houses. Yeah. So I think all this is shows how varied the historical layers of a phalca are. We know of records, even inscriptions actually, of the Lamo pati in Patandava Square in 1678 CE, which is NS, I think, 795. When this party was inaugurated, because it was established by two ministers of the king Srinivasa Malla, then for this occasion, kings and princes from across the valley and other kingdoms were invited. So even for an inauguration of a phalca, I mean, this one, of course, is a big one. It has 13 bays. It is really a demonstrative act of power and of visibility. These records are also very relevant. One thing that I would like to mention that I think is very important also for our documentation project is that, of course, there are certain tipping points, certain catastrophes when things would completely transform. And obviously, such an event is the Great Earthquake of 1934. For this, we also have records. So we can see inscriptions attached to phalcas when the reconstruction and renovation has been mentioned, and what has been renovated and what was donated. And for us, this is very, very important to have these layers of history because it shows how people were actually caring for and became caretakers of the very complex and dynamic heritage of Kathmandu Valley. And in that context then, in that context then, I think we are really proud that we can contribute to the various historical layers with our database, the Nepal Heritage Documentation Project, because I think it's one of the few and maybe also the most comprehensive, even though by no means really complete, inventory of architectural, social, religious, and historical change in the context of Newar, mainly architecture. We have, for instance, documented more than 250 phalcas in the context of Patan, and we have tried to mark as well as possible where the inscriptions are, what they say. We keep record of who is behind the donation or who was also complaining, for instance, about encroachment of a party. And for me, this is a very, very important part of contributing, ideally, in very intimate, actually, collaboration with Nepali historians, anthropologists, architects, map makers, and also local community to contribute with this database to the historical depth and documentation. Even though, having said that, I do not think that any kind of documentation is neutral. It always comes with a particular form of knowledge and interest. And in that sense, of course, for instance, we are not perfect for architects who might want to know how a specific building has changed over time, because we might not have the historical maps or photos that they would be looking to. We also have not really documented previous measurements of buildings. What we have done is we measure the width and the height. We do take record of the numbers of windows and so on and so forth. So in case, hopefully this will not be the case, but in case, for instance, there is another earthquake, maybe the database will even be able to provide information about the whereabouts and the kind of building that was once standing there. Yeah, this is a really good question. I do think that Dāphā, Bhajan, phalca, and processions are very intimately linked, and they basically almost need each other in order to exist. One could say that, I think, that they structure annual and monthly or particular ritual times and patterns, ranging from Astami to Gumla and Maga, from Indra Jatra to Gai Jatra, or of course, as we know, Matsyendranath Jatra. Phalcas are thus a very important part of an ensemble, actually, of ritually important places and practices. And they are connected also to other sites. They usually are part of a larger family, such as shrines. That could be a Ganesh shrine or a Balkumari shrine, but also Hittis and Jaruhittis. Because of course we know how important water is in ritual practice. But I think for you, it is most important to point out a little bit more the relevance of the phalcas to stage devotional music inside the phalca or in front of the phalca. And of course, there are some then where bhajan is regularly practiced, very often in smaller groups when it is regularly performed around 8 to 15 people maybe. And then there are, of course, also the big events for which both phalca-related kutis who look after rituals sometimes, but also the music colors get ready to contribute. Where food is offered to the devotees and the deities, sometimes also alcohol, but of course only in a very ritually confined context. And where the colors then perform, either on the site or where they reach out and follow the procession and go along with the procession. I find this a very, very eminent and remarkable part of participation that we can see there, and production of heritage. And I think then where your interest in inclusion comes in, it is really about community shaping and about neighborhood shaping. So this is something that, for instance, we see when certain processions draw incredibly big crowds across age groups. Young people come, people from other places in Kathmandu Valley, even foreigners would come. And I think the most prominent example in this context is Indra Jatra and the processions for the Ratu Matsyendranath. So for me, if I want to study urban transformation and intangible heritage, it is incredibly important to look at this entanglement of ritual practice and the places. Because even though some of the goodies and some of the music groups might have ceased to exist, it is really not a linear development. As I already said, there are still continuations and even revitalizations. And I just want to mention a couple of examples later. Let me just come to maybe highlight some of the important facets of this ritual dynamic that you can see at phalcas when it comes to music. So, for instance, you might know this very vibrant space Jasal in Patan, and there you would have the Narahiti phalca, which has been for a long time used very actively for Dāphā Bhajan. And when it collapsed in 2015 with the earthquake, there was a very quick decision actually of the community together with other stakeholders to rebuild the phalca in order to then also be able to to perform the bhajans again. And this was an initiative based on local interests, but also together with the representatives of Photo Kathmandu, of Photo Circle, and the UNESCO. So this was a joint effort, again, an inclusive effort actually, to show how important a place and also the performance of rituals is for a locality. Another example also from Chasal I would like to point out, which is very famous as well, is taking place at the Chapa, which is an extension or a variety of a phalca. It's usually a community house. It's based usually on the funding of the Sigutis. And the Abba phalca at Kwelachi is very famous for the shadow play, that takes place during Indra Jatra, and draws again substantial crowds from across Kathmandu Valley, increasingly also foreigners. And so in some ways, this place Chasal has become a hotspot, maybe one could say, for both the performance of rituals, where music plays a very important role, and Dāphā bhajan, of course, as well, and the nurturing of the sites, such as the phalcas. So not only temples and large kind of 5-star heritage is what lies at the heart of urban transformation and needs to be taken serious. So I think maybe these are good examples to show that there's still a topography of ritual encounters and ritual dynamics. One more example before I come to the last one, I think that has been impressive for me beyond belief, actually, also is the ritual of exhibiting deities and masks, usually, in phalcas. And these could be Bhairav masks, but these could then also be the murtis of deities such as Indra, Ganesh. This is something that has come to an end also because some of the masks are said to have been displaced while they were exhibited in the phalcas, meaning they disappeared. And we can guess for what reason and what happened. But there's one example of a very interesting, I think, ritual performance in the phalca, and that is the display of Bhairav masks in the context of Bhairav becoming the god of rice beer. That is usually then something mainly for men participating in the ritual of consuming, of course, sacred alcohol, the rice beer that is poured from an elevated plinth and exhibited or accompanied by dancing and singing and music. There are plenty of other examples really that show the interconnectivity of music, of procession and of phalca. Maybe just one more example, sorry, there are just so many that just came to my mind, and that is the importance of Navadurga rituals in Kathmandu Valley, and not for tourist purposes actually, something that has been witnessed to be revived again in the last couple of years, and where phalcas play a very important role, such as in the context of the procession of Navadurgas from Teku to Patandava Square during Dasain, where they stop over also at particular sites, again, shrines, temples, but phalcas as well. For instance, in Sunakoti, where you have the Kwelachi phalca that has been newly rebuilt and that has become a stopover in in this procession that happens at day and at night, actually throughout. Now, the last example, and that is, I think, the biggest one that I find so important because it also shows how integrative and dynamic the entanglement of ritual place and ritual performance is the example of one particular monastery, the Jabba. It lies south of Mangal Bazaar and Patandava Square, and it is framed by two phalcas that are very important for Dāphā bhajans. And one phalca collapsed completely in the earthquakes of 2015. The other was badly damaged. So both of the phalcas were not actively used for bhajan anymore. And in fact, the bhajan groups complained that they could not perform bhajan any longer because of the fact that they could not use the phalcas. We were in interaction with these groups along various lines. For instance, in a project with Rajendra Shakya, who's a heritage expert, and with Sujan Chitrakar, professor from Kathmandu University, the art and design department. And we decided that we wanted to include this site and the ritual performance in the context of the first international photo festival called Photo Kathmandu that took place 6 months after the earthquake happened. And we decided to choose phalcas that were important for the idea of developing a future perspective for the communities that were so badly haunted by the earthquake. And we decided together with the music groups to perform music, to have them perform music during the festival. And that was something that was very encouraging for the musicians, but also for the neighborhood, because they started to look at the ritual performance as something they were very proud of and something that showed that in the aftermath of the earthquake, life can go on, and that ritual life plays a very important role in this, and also ritual sites. So maybe to just wrap up this example, we had the music performance during the festival, but we also had installations. For instance, in the badly damaged or completely damaged phalca that was mainly used by the Tamraka community, we exhibited photographs of the music instruments that had been buried under the rubble of the collapsed house and phalca. And in the other phalca, that was actually closed mainly, but you could look through. We had large portrait photos of the musicians lit at night, and it was a stunning sight, and music that would be continuously played. And that was something that, so to say, put the whole set of sites and practices in a very, I think, interesting and engaging frame. And here really, I think one can see that the entanglement of site and practice can lead to something that yet still includes and activates and dynamizes neighborhood. If you want, you can look at our database in the Nepal Heritage Project that we set up. I will share the links. Yeah, I really think that is at the heart of my own research and engagement with urban transformation and Kathmandu Valley's vibrant cultural heritage and everyday practice. So yeah, why is it important? What kind of a role could the pati play? But one could extend that question actually to the Dāphā music practice as well. I think both actually play a very important role because they are part of a very particular quality of Newar life. So a strong actually binding of community still through membership in guttis and in various groups. And that of course is also connected to ritual practice. But also this amazing phenomenon that, to be honest, I have so far not really seen, for instance, in India, even though I have been working there and living there for a long time, mainly in Delhi, that is this openness of places to inviting for various groups to together and creating, maybe one could say, a South Asian public sphere. Again, I'm aware of the fact that there are many invisible lines of division and exclusion on the basis of caste, on the basis of class as well, and religion. But I do think that the phalca in today's times, when cities are so incredibly fast in changing their environment, almost breathless, and especially in Kathmandu Valley, which is one of the most speedy, actually, metropolitan regions in Asia. The phalca then can really become a place where one can start to rethink what kind of city do we want for the future? What kind of city do we want for our children? Do we want just fast, large, modern? Or do we actually want to also allow for places of inertia, for places of gathering, for places of diverse inclusion? And I think actually this is where both Dāphā Bhajan and phalca can play a very, very important role. The last point I think is also where they can play a very important role is that we have to be careful that cities in promoting heritage, which is of course important. It's also important for the tourist economy. It's important in many ways, but we have to be careful that this kind of heritagization does not museumify the place or gentrify the neighborhood. By museumifying, I mean that very often there's a strong sense of then fixing heritage and asking it to remain static. Almost untouchable, and this is something where Dāphā Bhajan really plays an important role, because this is living heritage, right? So let me just give you 3 examples, that 3 or 4, very quickly. I hope I can be a little bit faster, that I think are important gestures towards thinking about phalca, thinking about Dāphā Bhajan as moments of rethinking what kind of city we would like to have, or the Newars would like to have, or Nepalis would like to live in. So it's really a fundamental question, not just about heritage as something nice to have, but a city as a place one really wants to live in. One example is that of Pimbahal, which is a tool in Patan that has really strongly invested in its self-beautification. And I say self-beautification in 2 ways, because I think in some ways it can also lead to a very glossy surface. But Pimbahal has really managed to dynamize the enthusiasm of local communities living in and around the pond to invest in keeping some of the built structures alive, and not only the built structures, but also the rituals connected to them. And to even invite for new rituals to happen, new processions, exhibitions, music festival, even heritage festival. And in that context, since the earthquake of 2015, Pimbahal has really made it almost like Chasal, but I think still they have to be separated into promoting itself, branding itself, both for tourists, for middle class Nepalis who go to the mall, who go to the movies, and then in the evening come to Pimbahal and walk around the pond, but also to local communities to feel proud about this. And I think this is really important. So it can be both to promote a place for tourism, to open it up for some kind of cosmopolitan feeling about heritage, but also a deeply rooted investment in the locally grown, historically grown practices. The second example I want to bring is a very interesting case set in Sunakoti, south of Lalitpur, still part actually of Lalitpur, and where road widening had been planned for a long time. And along the line of that road that leads through the growing small town that sits almost next to Bungamati, there are lots of shrines, there are lots of old houses, there are incredibly old chaityas, for instance, and then there are remarkably carved phalcas as well. And the intention of the population, of the locals living there, was to, on the one hand, of course, get rid of the enormous traffic that really harms the life of the town, because there's almost no possibility sometimes to walk across. There's incredible noise, and of course there is a lot of pollution. But they also didn't want to give up these important sites of their heritage. And so for many years, and I know a remarkable couple of architects who have been strongly invested in creating a very democratic, open atmosphere to discuss how can we get rid of that traffic and the noise and the pollution and still retain our setup of heritage sites that are so important for us. They engage with various stakeholders, with the DOA, with parties, and also with locals who actually wanted the street to be widened because they thought this was a part of modernization. So Sunakoti, at the end, I think, has been very successful in revitalizing heritage, in investing in reconstruction and rebuilding of some of their places, such as Kwelachi Phalca, which is next to the street and has been rebuilt after the earthquake. I think this is a very, very important example where the community, let's say the community is very heterogeneous, gets together and invests in thinking about what city do we want to have. And we certainly don't want one where all our beautiful ritual sites and practices disappear because we have committed to modernization. So there's an interesting actually combination of modernization and awareness of how important it is to preserve, but also to open up for new ideas. Third example, quickly, is this photo exhibition that I already referred to earlier, Photo Kathmandu, where together with Rajendra Shakya and Sujan Chitraka, we developed this curated walk connecting patis that we thought were very interesting and could be visited by people who went to see photo Kathmandu. And by that we opened up a new landscape of ritually and socially and culturally important sites, where at every phalca we told stories about the people who used the phalcas. We made interviews with people who sat in the phalcas, either because they were selling stuff or just spending time. And I think this also contributes to thinking about how the city is transformed and how people can engage and participate in its transformation. So it's not just that we are passively seeing how our city is changing, but we are actively involved. And I think you, with your Dāphā Calling and thinking about how important Dāphā is for being in place, would play a crucial role in this kind of reinvestment of city production. The last example is one that happened immediately after the earthquake in 2015, when a neighborhood in Bhaktapur, Tulubiasi, almost completely collapsed. And there was a deep investment in various stakeholders, among them an art collective called Artry Nepal from Kathmandu, who went to Tulubiasi and started to think about strategies of how to help the people there whose houses have collapsed, whose public spaces had been filled with rubble, whose family members have been killed, whose working networks had been destroyed, how to come to terms with thinking about culture and urban regeneration. As I said, phalca in that played an important role in that they use this phalca idea as a public space where people could sit and gather and tell each other stories and spend time together, as a metaphor and as a practice to tie the community together again, to bring them together, to give them a place where they could move and spend time. Because after the earthquake, the immediate result was actually that there was an incredible fragmentation. Some people had to move to other places. Some people were just constantly occupied with thinking about survival and thinking about or feeling the trauma of the earthquake. And so there was this initiative by Subhas Tamang, mainly, one of the members of Artry Nepal, to come with this idea of Basi Bialo, which meant come together all the members of the Tulubiasi community to think about who we are, who we want to be. And for me, this is the last interesting example where one can see how intimately the past actually can make us think about the future and about living in the future city that is undergoing incredible transformations, not only because of the earthquake, but also because of economic liberalization and the shift from monarchy to democracy and so on and so forth. I think this is a very difficult question because I'm also not a specialist on cities around the world. The cities I know best are the ones, or some at least, in Europe and then South Asia. And I think sometimes I feel I know Kathmandu better than my own home, because I get around much more and I'm much more open and I'm exploring much more than when I am back in Germany. Yeah, I think partly the question about public spaces, of which phalcas are part, is one, if you think about so-called modernity, because I actually do not think that there is one modernity. I think there are various histories of making and experiencing ideas of being modern or being part of modernity. And I think in that context, one of the most obvious developments that you can see across the globe, if I can now generalize, is a growing tendency to close down public spaces or to privatize public spaces, to install video cameras, for instance, so that people's movement can be surveyed allegedly for people's security and for safe cities. So there's a huge debate about how unsafe, for instance, the public spaces in New York or Berlin or Delhi, for instance, are. This is something I find interesting that has not really started so much in Nepal yet, and I hope it will not happen as well. This whole safe city discourse is something that is very much based also on creating a feeling of insecurity and also of certain others that are threatening the feeling of safety. So that, I think, is one part. There's a growing commercialization of public spaces that you can see across the world that, of course, affects how public spaces are used. I think there are many pleasant ways of using public spaces commercially. For instance, in Italy, where you have public places, squares, occupied by cafes, or in France, where people can sit and hang out almost as if the cafe was a phalca. But of course, there are then also moments when public is encroached onto, and this, in fact, is something that you can now witness in Kathmandu Valley, that public places are occupied by parking lots or by malls. You have religious sites, which is very interesting and I think quite questionable and worrisome. You have hittis, for instance, or you have larger religious places that are lying empty for a long time, that are not constantly used, only for particular rituals or maybe for a very small number of people, and where stakeholders related to real estate, for instance, have now discovered that in the middle of a city that is booming so much and where real estate prices are going also through the ceiling, these sites could be actually capitalized on. So you have a privatization and commercialization of public/religious places. And one thing that I find remarkable in a place like Patan, maybe more than Kathmandu still, is these countless courtyards that are yet not really encroached by motorbikes or cars or shops. And that form a very interesting combination of a community space, of a very small, actually, locality and a toll, usually made up of a particular or dominant caste, but also evoking a sense of openness that is very much appreciated also, for example, but not most importantly, by tourists. So I think this is a very important and to be watched movement, the privatization, commercialization of public places. And here the last example I would like to make comes in, that is of the recent growing heritage activism that you can find in Kathmandu Valley. mostly in Kathmandu Valley, also to some extent, I guess, outside of the valley. And that is also covering a very large spectrum of interests and aspirations. So you would have people who are very much kind of tailored towards claiming the heritage of a particular community, their heritage, and therefore sometimes run the danger of excluding other people who might want to support the idea of protecting heritage from commercialization, from privatization, such as in the case of Kokana, of these, where these mega projects are really impacting the life, the everyday life and the ritual life of people there, and where Kokana itself has become, quite like Sunakoti, a place of resistance and a place of claiming ideas for a different city and for a different kind of community. You have Hitti activism, where people now increasingly start saying Hittis are not our dumping sites. And actually the Hittis also show that there is a decrease in water level. We need to think differently about using our cities, exploiting the resources in our cities. And thus Hitti becomes a metaphor for thinking differently about what kind of city one should live in. And there is also growing phalca activism. And initiatives of, let's say, even the mayor of Lalitpur to support the construction of phalcas, even though they might harm a modern space, such as in Pulchok, where you have the case of one phalca being built almost on the street next to the Ashoka stupa, and in front of a bank. That caused a lot of discussion, but nevertheless the phalca was bound to be made. So here you can see that I'm trying to combine again ideas about thinking about what is happening in the world with thinking actually what is happening in the world of the city in Kathmandu Valley. Yeah, I mean, aging, or let's say the older populations in cities, has really become something I've grown fond about, to know more about their experiences, about their memories, about how they see and perceive social change, economic change, cultural change. And for me, again, then, like the phalca itself, talking to elderly people, senior citizens, in Lalitpur has been an eye-opener in many ways into how they see that the city is speeding up, that certain social relations are falling apart, that certain forms of belonging to place are becoming increasingly irrelevant or less important, at least to the younger generations, because their priorities are changing. So in the context of Patis in Patan, which was part of the Photo Kathmandu exhibition, but also in a more extensive way with the help, again, of Rajendra Shakya, we would search people and informants, talk to them, who we found in phalcas, in and around phalcas, to see what made them come there, how they spent their time, how they talk to each other, what is important, what they observe. So partly we were using their oral histories then in order to nourish the curated walk that Patis in Patan became, but also because I was so interested in learning more about everyday life of senior citizens in this rapidly transforming urban environment. And when I say rapidly transforming urban environment, of course, I'm thinking about the historic center around Dāphā Square, where you can already see that on the one hand, there is a kind of gentrification around the Dāphā, where people try to invite tourists to live there, spend their holidays, and walk around, but where also in some of the courtyards around Dāphā Square, you would find actually quite secluded communities. And this was what made me so interested, how they saw that there was a certain drive towards modernity and development that they would not completely disagree with, but many of the old people actually who live and feel part of the old city see that, of course, the young people, for instance, want to leave the historic city because they feel if not they were able to tear down an old house and build a new modern one, they would almost feel trapped in these narrow ceilings, dark houses, no modern facilities like bathrooms and running water and electricity, also not in plenty. So a lot of the young people and families, if they are not moving out of Nepal anyway, would move to the peripheries of the old city, behind the ring road. And this in many ways was hurtful for the senior citizens. Because they would have preferred to actually stay. I mean, of course, I cannot talk about everybody and for everybody, but in many of the interviews, it was seen as with a certain sadness that the priorities of young people to pay attention, for instance, to phalcas as an important public space, almost as a living room, yeah. Or Dāphā Bhajan, where young people simply don't have the time to invest themselves, to get up early in the morning and then go to work and then come maybe back from work late and yet having to go and perform bhajan. This is something that many young people who work in a profession that is triggered by different temporalities, not field work, for instance, but work in offices, it is simply not possible to follow and nourish certain rituals. And this is seen by the old people and understood. And there's a lot of compassion. But of course, there's also a lot of regret that they see there are no more young people coming to join the Dāphā Bhajan groups. There are not so many young people except for the kids who play or the babies whom the elderly look after, who would sit in the phalcas because they would rather go to the shopping mall, to a trendy restaurant, to a nice cafe. Who wants to sit in the pati or in the phalca? So this is what I think one can observe very well. And one last thing, I do think that the memories, the oral histories of the elderlies in this context are very important in order to understand how certain rituals had been performed, how certain communities had interacted, how the shape of the city was changed. So their retrospective, I think, is really crucial to understand where we are today and where one could then maybe go towards. It doesn't always have to mean we go towards one modernity. It can mean that we go and take along the dynamics of our ritual culture, of our living heritage, and for that I think we need the elderly. We need their histories, we need their knowledge, we need their practical knowledge and competence. Besides, I think it is very important for young people to see that their ancestors have been, for instance, farmers who were harvesting fields that are no longer existing because now they are built upon by several story high brick houses where people live in. So the fact, I think, that the young can learn from the old about their knowledge of the past that can be revisited and appropriated and included and taken forward into the future, I think is really a very important experience.